What if the fear of black people in America was never actually about crime or about behavior? What if it's a ghost? A phantom fear passed down from a time when the highest court in the land declared that black people weren't people at all, but property? In this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on the historical playbook that created this fear and show how it's still running our lives today, from our police to our schools. Stick around. There's a specter haunting America. It's a deep, foundational anxiety that shapes our society in ways most of us don't even see. It's the fear of black people. We see its shadow in the flashing police lights in a rear-view mirror, in the funding gaps between schools, in the reflexive clutching of a purse when a black man walks by. But this fear isn't natural. It's not an organic response to a genuine threat. It was manufactured. It was engineered on purpose, written into law, and locked into place over centuries with brutal, chilling precision. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a historical fact. A playbook was written, and its rules are still in effect, often running silently in the background of our institutions and even our own minds. The core argument of this playbook is simple and devastating. To justify the economic system of slavery, you had to systematically strip an entire race of people of their humanity. And to keep control over this dehumanized population, you had to frame them as a terrifying existential threat. The fear of black people was created to rationalize and uphold a system of white supremacy. It was never about who black people actually were. It was about what that system needed them to be. To understand why a simple traffic stop can turn deadly, or why the racial wealth gap refuses to close, we can't just look at today. We have to go back to the moment the playbook was written into the highest law of the land. We have to start with the original sin. The year is 1857. The case is Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had lived with his owner in free states and territories. He sued for his freedom, arguing that living on free soil made him a free man. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the nation held its breath. The court's decision wasn't just a ruling. It was a thunderclap that would echo for generations. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, writing for Majority, delivered one of the most infamous rulings in American history. He declared that people of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, could not be American citizens. And because they weren't citizens, they had no right to sue in federal court. In his bone-chilling words, they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This decision legally nullified the personhood of black Americans, reducing them to the status of property. This was way more than a legal loss for one man. It was the moment of legalized dehumanization. The highest court in the country had officially signed off on the idea that black people were not people in the eyes of the law. They were chattel, objects. They could be bought, sold, and exploited without any moral or legal consequences. Why was this catastrophic step necessary? Because the entire economic engine of the South, and a lot of the northern industries that supported it, was built on forced labor. To maintain a system that brutal, you first have to create a moral justification for it. You can't, in a nation supposedly founded on liberty, enslave millions of your fellow human beings. But you can enslave property. So, the playbook's first chapter was written. Define the target population as less than human. This was propped up by the rise of so-called scientific racism. Influential men, including figures like Thomas Jefferson, had called for science to prove the inferiority of black people. This wasn't a real scientific question. It was a search for an excuse. Fields like phrenology and biology were twisted to create a body of evidence suggesting black people were intellectually and morally inferior, more childlike, more impulsive, and incapable of self-governance. This narrative was crucial. It gave society psychological permission to accept slavery. It allowed an enslaver to believe he wasn't committing a sin, but simply managing his livestock. It let the rest of the white population accept the brutal hierarchy, because they, too, were taught to see black people as fundamentally different. This dehumanization is what laid the groundwork for the fear. Because once you build a society on such a monstrous lie, you live in constant terror of that lie being exposed. The fear during slavery wasn't just about a potential uprising, though that was part of it. The deeper fear was a collapse of the entire social and economic order. It was a fear that if black people were ever seen as fully human, the whole system of white supremacy, the system that gave even the poorest white person a sense of status, would crumble. This is the source code of American fear. The anxiety wasn't born from a real threat posed by black individuals, but from the instability of a system built on violent oppression. And to manage that anxiety, the playbook needed a second chapter, the creation of phantom threat. When the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the playbook didn't just disappear. It evolved. The chains were gone, but the system needed new ways to keep the old hierarchy in place. The fear of black people had to be updated for a new era. You can see the origins of this even before emancipation, with the slave patrols, created in the Carolinas in the early 1700s. These were militia-style groups whose only job was to terrorize and suppress the black population. They hunted runaway slaves, crushed rebellions, and enforced the brutal codes of plantation with extreme violence. These patrols were America's first state-sponsored police, and their DNA, the idea that black people are a threat to be managed with force, was passed down directly to modern law enforcement. After the war, the fear of a newly freed black population, a population now demanding wages, land, and political power, sent a shockwave of panic through much of the white South. The phantom threat had to be made real in everyone's minds. So, a new myth was born and aggressively promoted, the myth of the black brute. It was a vile caricature that painted black men as hypersexual, predatory animals who were a direct threat to the purity of white women. This wasn't a random stereotype. It was a calculated tool of psychological warfare. The fear of black sexuality became the go-to excuse for unspeakable acts of terror. It was the engine of the lynching era. Between 1877 and 1950, thousands of black Americans, mostly men, were publicly tortured and murdered by white mobs. These lynchings were almost always justified by false accusations of raping a white woman, a lie that was amplified by newspapers and politicians. But let's be crystal clear, lynching was never about justice. It was a tool of social control. These weren't secret murders. They were public spectacles. Whole families, even children, would attend. Photos were taken and turned into postcards. These were acts of ritualized terror designed to send a clear message to the entire black community. Stay in your place. Don't vote. Don't ask for better pay. Don't challenge the racial order, or this could be you. At the same time, black women were hit with a double-edged sword. They were stereotyped as hypersexual, which was used to justify their sexual exploitation by white men, while also denying the protections of womanhood that were given to white women. They were still seen as property, and their bodies were treated that way. The phantom threat worked perfectly. It reframed the desire for white supremacy as a necessary act of self-defense. Violence against black people wasn't seen as aggression. It was framed as defense against a dangerous, subhuman threat. This narrative allowed an entire society to either participate in or quietly approve of a nationwide campaign of domestic terrorism. The fear wasn't of actual crime. It was of black autonomy. It was a fear of black people simply existing as free individuals outside the grip of white control. The system needed a monster, so it invented one and then punished real people for it. But public terror was messy. To truly lock the system in for the long haul, the fear had to be institutionalized. It had to become the law of the land. All over again, as Reconstruction ended and federal troops left the South, the playbook for controlling black Americans entered a new, more sinister phase. The raw terror of the lynch mob was about to be sanitized, formalized, and written into law. This was the era of Jim Crow. On the surface, Jim Crow laws were about segregation, separate water fountains, separate schools, separate everything. But their real purpose was much darker. They were a legal framework designed to criminalize black existence and reestablish a system of near slavery. This was done through a web of laws known as the Black Codes. These codes made a joke of freedom. They criminalized everyday behaviors for black people that were perfectly legal for white people. Vagrancy laws meant that any black person who couldn't prove they were employed by a white man could be arrested. Laws against loitering, breaking curfew, or even speaking too loudly to get you thrown in jail. These petty crimes were aggressively enforced, causing the arrests of black men to skyrocket across the South. But the goal wasn't just to fill jails. It was to feed a monstrous new system called convict leasing. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. This loophole was exploited with ruthless efficiency. Southern states, broke after the war, realized they could make a fortune by leasing out their prisoners, overwhelmingly black men convicted of trivial offenses, to private corporations. These lease convicts became a new form of enslaved labor. They were sent to work in coal mines, lumber camps, and on plantations, often owned by the same men who had once been slaveholders. The conditions were frequently even worse than slavery. An enslaver had a financial incentive to keep his property alive. A company leasing a convict for a few months had no such incentive. The men were literally worked to death, starved, and beaten without any oversight. It was, as it's been called, slavery by another name. This system perfected the playbook. The narrative was no longer just that black people were property. The new, more durable narrative was that black people were criminals. The fear was now officially tied to the justice system. To be black was to be inherently suspicious. This is the poison root of so much of the racial bias we see in our criminal justice system today. It drew a direct line from skin color to criminality in the American mind. The fear that was once used to justify slave patrols was now used to justify a police state that targeted black communities. The system didn't just respond to crime. It manufactured criminals to feed its own economic needs. The black codes and convict leasing were never about public safety. They were about labor control and social dominance. They were a brilliant, brutal update to the playbook, ensuring that even without the title of slave, black people remain a controlled, exploitable, and feared underclass. The playbook, written in the ink of the Dred Scott decision and rewritten in the blood of Jim Crow, wasn't thrown away during the Civil Rights era. It was digitized. It became the operating system running in the background of our modern institutions, often invisible to those who aren't its direct targets. This is where the historical foundation of fear crashes into our lives today. There is a straight, unbroken line from the slave patrols of the 1700s to the enforcers of the black codes to the modern American police officer. The mission has been updated and the language has been sanitized, but the core function is often the same: controlling a population that has been historically defined as a threat. The NAACP states that the origins of modern-day policing can be traced back to the slave patrol. This history explains why black Americans are so disproportionately caught up in the justice system. They are more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to be searched, more likely to be arrested, and sentenced more harshly than white people for the same crimes. A black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped without just cause than a white person. Black men make up about 13% of the male population, but about 35% of those in prison. The NAACP reports that African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. The war on drugs is a perfect modern example. Laws like the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine had a devastatingly racist impact. Crack, being cheaper, was more common in poor black communities, while powder cocaine was more common among affluent whites. The result? Black defendants got sentences that were exponentially longer than white defendants for basically the same drug offense. Today, more black people are under control of the correction system than were enslaved in 1850. This all culminates in the most tragic outcomes: the use of deadly force. The fear of the black brute, that phantom threat manufactured after slavery, still lives in our collective subconscious. This implicit bias can turn a wallet into a gun in the blink of an eye. It creates a world where black people are far more likely to be killed by police than white people. The result is a deep, justified fear of the system in the black community, shown by the necessity of the talk, where black parents have to teach their kids how to behave around police just to survive an encounter. The fear of black bodies is matched only by the fear of black minds. The same scientific racism that justified slavery also pushed the myth of black intellectual inferiority. For a century, this belief was the cornerstone of segregated, unequal education. The goal wasn't just to separate students. It was to deliberately undereducate black children, to limit their horizons, and keep them at the bottom of the economic ladder. Today, schools aren't legally segregated by race, but they're often segregated by zip code, a direct legacy of housing discrimination. This means schools in majority black districts get significantly less funding than those in white, suburban districts. But the playbook's influence is even more direct in what we now call the school-to-prison pipeline. This is the alarming trend of pushing students, especially black students, out of schools and into the justice system. It starts with discipline. Black students are suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white students, often for the same minor stuff like disruptive behavior. In the 2017-18 school year, black students were about 15% of the student body, but accounted for over 31% of all school-related arrests. The rise of police officers in schools has only sped this up. A schoolyard scuffle that once meant detention now gets a kid arrested for assault. This happens disproportionately to black students. Once a kid is pushed out of school, they are 8 times more likely to end up incarcerated. This isn't about safety, it's about control. It's the playbook's prophecy fulfilling itself. The dehumanization at the heart of the fear playbook has had devastating consequences for black health. The legacy starts with a brutal history of medical experimentation on black bodies, which were seen not as patients to be healed, but as subjects for discovery. The so-called father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, perfected his surgical techniques by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia, justifying with the racist belief that black people don't feel pain the same way white people do. This wasn't a one-off. From the forced sterilization of black women to the notorious Tuskegee syphilis study, where the U.S. government watched hundreds of black men suffer and die from a treatable disease for 40 years just to study it, the medical establishment has a dark history of abusing African Americans. This isn't just history. That bias persists today. Studies show that many medical professionals still hold false beliefs about biological differences between black and white patients, like the idea that black patients have a higher pain tolerance. This leads to the undertreatment of black pain for everything from a broken bone to cancer. The consequences are stark. Black women are about 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. Black Americans have higher rates of chronic disease and lower life expectancies. The fear of being disbelieved, dismissed, or experimented on is a real and present danger for black patients in the American healthcare system. The fear playbook has been one of the most powerful tools for shaping the American economy. Its most potent weapon? Housing segregation, institutionalized through a practice called redlining. Starting in the 1930s, the federal government drew color-coded maps of American cities. Neighborhoods where black people live were literally outlined in red, deemed hazardous, and systematically denied the federally backed mortgages that were building the American middle class. This wasn't just a banking practice. It was federal policy. It locked black families out of the single greatest engine for wealth creation in post-war America, homeownership. While white families built generational wealth buying homes in the suburbs, black families were trapped in under-resourced urban neighborhoods, forced to rent or take on predatory loans. Real estate agents even used blockbusting, stoking fear in white homeowners that black families were moving in to cause panic selling at low prices, only to sell those same homes to black families at inflated prices. The effects of redlining are the primary driver of the massive racial wealth gap that exists today. It created concentrated pockets of poverty and food deserts. It starved entire communities of investment for decades. The fear of black neighbors, the fear of falling property values, was really just a fear of integration. When you look at a map of wealth or health in any major American city today, you are, in many ways, still looking at a redlining map from 80 years ago. We're covering centuries of pretty heavy history here, and I know it's a lot to take in, but understanding this is power. If you're finding this breakdown valuable and you agree this history needs to be heard, take a second to subscribe. We need more people in this conversation, and your support really helps make that happen. The consequences of this playbook aren't just institutional, they're deeply personal, carried in the minds and bodies of black Americans. This constant stress of navigating a society that sees you as a threat has a name: racial battle fatigue. Coined by scholar William A. Smith, it's the cumulative result of being constantly exposed to racially dismissive and hostile environments. It's the mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion from always having to be on guard, It shows up as real physical symptoms: high blood pressure, headaches, chronic stress, the body literally keeping score. This leads to a state of hypervigilance, the exhausting, subconscious math of figuring out which spaces are safe. It's code switching, changing how you talk and act seem less threatening to a white audience. It's the constant self-monitoring that black parents teach their children. This isn't paranoia. It's a learned survival skill in a country that's afraid of you. Over time, this continuous exposure can lead to racial trauma, which is like PTSD. But the threat is woven into the fabric of society. It can be triggered by a direct experience with racism, or just by seeing the endless loop of videos of black people being harmed. Paradoxically, the psychological weight has also forged an incredible legacy of resilience. Black cultural expression, from spirituals to blues, jazz, and hip-hop, has always been a powerful counter-narrative. It's a space to process the pain, challenge the stereotypes, and fiercely affirm black humanity. Social movements are another form of this resistance. Black Lives Matter, which emerged in 2013, isn't new. It's the modern version of a 400-year struggle for liberation. When activists chant Black Lives Matter, they're not just protesting police brutality. They're pushing back against the entire historical playbook. They're challenging the foundational lie of Dred Scott, the terror of Jim Crow, and the systemic disregard for black life that continues today. They're demanding that America finally face the ghost in its machine. So, let's go back to the original question. Why does America fear black people? As we've seen, this fear was never natural. It was a political and economic strategy. It started with a catastrophic legal decision in 1857, Dred Scott v. Sanford, that said a human being could be property. To justify that, a narrative of inferiority was created. And to enforce it, a playbook of fear was written. That playbook taught America to fear black rebellion. So it created slave patrols that grew into our modern police forces. It taught America to fear black autonomy. So it invented the black brute myth to justify lynching. It taught America to fear black equality. So it wrote that fear into Jim Crow laws, turning blackness itself into a criminal offense. And that playbook is still running. Its rules show up as a school-to-prison pipeline. Its legacy is the redlining that engineered today's racial wealth gap. Its poison is in our healthcare system, where black patients still suffer from the echoes of medical racism. The fear of black people in America is a phantom, a ghost inherited from a slave-owning past. But the damage it does is terrifyingly real. Maybe we need to reframe the question. The real issue isn't the fear of black people. It's America's fear of itself, the fear of facing the ugly truths of its own history. It's the anxiety of a dominant group fearing the loss of an unearned status. The fear isn't a response to a threat. It's a consequence of a system designed to maintain a racial hierarchy. This isn't about guilt. Guilt is paralyzing. This is about understanding. And understanding empowers us to act. It's about finally taking responsibility for the house we all live in, even if we didn't personally lay its cracked foundation. So what's the way forward? It starts with dismantling the playbook. It means rejecting the narratives of fear. It means investing in communities that have been systematically plundered for centuries. It means demanding accountability from our police, our courts, our schools, and our hospitals. It means seeing the disparities not as failures of people, but as failures of system. The first step is always education. Share this video, not to win an argument, but to start a conversation. Second, go deeper. Read the work of the historians and scholars who have dedicated their lives to uncovering this truth. Support the organizations on the ground fighting for real policy change. And finally, challenge a playbook in your own life. When you hear the old, tired stereotypes, speak up. When you see bias at work, at school, or in your community, have the courage to name it. The fear was designed to control and divide us. Understanding is a first step to breaking free. And together, we can start the long, hard work of writing a new American story, one without ghosts. Thank you for watching.